Okay, so here's a video about eBay and flea market finds and some of the best kept secrets, or let's just say little known tidbits, in the world of tactical two-way radios, which are readily accessible to the general public. In the late 1990s, Motorola was in a race with other two-way radio manufacturers such as AudioVox and Cobra and other companies that had previously been in the CB radio and the commercial consumer grade radio business to get the growing their piece of the action on the growing FRS radio market, which was being slated to replace CB radio for unlicensed amateur civilian, just everybody walkie-talkie use. Part of that reason is a planned eventual shutdown of the CB radio frequencies for public use, shifting those out of common usage and being able to split those bandwidths for use with other types of wireless devices. One of the things happening was recognized as part of a long-term plan at the FCC was to put unlicensed civilian two-way radio usage into a narrower spectrum with taking advantage of higher quality radios. The other thing is to engineer into the radios transmit power limitations so that they couldn't be hot-rodded and blow over into other frequencies the way is common with CB and sideband style radios. Part of that engineering was that the radios operate on a relatively narrow frequency range, but it's digitally controlled within a radio. So if somebody's transmitting on channel 1 or 2, it actually represents an FM frequency, and you would have to use a frequency counter or a chart to translate what those are. They initially were not standardized across the manufacturer spectrum, which meant that channel 1 or channel 2 from one manufacturer was not going to be the same as channel 1 or 2 from another manufacturer. Eventually, those did become standardized. The other thing that would happen is there was a tone squelch privacy feature. Now, tone squelch is a situation that's been relatively common in the amateur radio world for a while, but not always used. And what a tone squelch is that every time you would press the transmit key, the radio transmits a sub-audible digital code, which the other radios will pick up and then unsquelch that frequency, which means that the radios on the receiving end will be set to selectively ignore transmissions which do not include that sub-audio digital code. That's what tone squelch is. I'm going to explain this one more time, because it becomes a little bit more important later in the video. The privacy codes and a tone squelch are a code that's embedded into every transmission on a radio that has that. That radio will transmit in addition to whatever else you transmit, let's say your voice, but in some cases you can transmit some data on these. Then what it's also going to transmit is a sub-audible code, a tone, which you're not going to hear, but the radio is set to digitally pick up that code and will unsquelch the transmission. So if the radio is set to ignore all other transmissions on that frequency except those which are using that code, then you're capable of having multiple radio groups operating on the same frequency with very little interference between each other because of the way the tone squelch works. Now, in particularly crowded areas, you may still have a little bit of interference, but usually you're not going to, because not everybody is transmitting simultaneously. But it's possible to have a little bit of interference if, let's say, one person is transmitting with a correct code and then another person begins transmitting at the same time. that radio will have set itself to accept the rest of the transmission on that frequency once that code was entered, and will continue to accept that transmission until the original transmitter who had sent that code lets up on their push to talk button. So what could happen on those types of radios is, let's say I'm talking for a couple of minutes, anybody else while I'm talking may press their transmit button, and everybody I'm talking to whose radio has accepted the code of my transmission will then also accept codes of other transmissions. But sometimes it doesn't work like that, and sometimes it does. One of the things that would happen on those is that if you simply let up and rekey your mic, then it resets itself. Now, if you're using a Singar's frequency hopping radio, the other thing it will do, in addition to the tone squelch, is it will change frequencies. Sometimes slightly, sometimes a lot. But what happened on the frequency hopping stuff, and one reason it never really made it into the family radio service world, even though it's possible to do that, is that frequency hopping radios frequently get out of synchronization with each other, and then that becomes a problem. And what's interesting is that the government got really into frequency hopping. Cell phones have gotten really into frequency hopping. It never quite made it into this technology. One of the things they did do with this technology is they took the tone squelch system a little bit further, and they went with only on some brands, specifically Motorola and Garmin, because Garmin was doing two-way radios for a little while. And what they did was they put a scramble feature in. Now what scramble did was they took some actually very old technology, World War II technology, and they digitized it. And voice inversion scrambler was originally discovered with faulty transmitter equipment, and they found that if certain little parts were put in backwards, the voice would come through just fine if the receiver had some of the same stuff put in backwards, as far as the little transistors or diodes or something like that. Although it wasn't diodes, I guess it was vacuum tubes. But if something in there had reverse polarity, had been assembled wrong, if both the transmitter and receiver had been assembled wrong, apparently those two were capable of talking to each other. But if they were trying to communicate with one that had not been assembled wrong, there was a problem. Well, somebody very quickly figured out that if they could engineer a switch that would reverse polarity on certain little things in there, that they could make their transmissions, even though somebody could pick up and hear their transmissions, it would be very difficult, it would be unintelligible to somebody who's listening to that. And that was used in early scrambled communication radios and equipment in order to provide an extra layer of communication security. Well, fast forward to the CB radio world, nobody really wanted to screw around with scrambled CB radios, although some of the custom hot rod guys did mess with it a little bit. And the scrambled communications were actually used more in the NASCAR world and in sports than anything else. They were usually your civilian buyers for scrambled communication, especially among coaches and professional football teams and that sort of a thing. It was technically illegal to use, but they had so much money at stake in professional football games, they went ahead and used scrambled communications anyway, because there would be a lot of people from the opposing team or sympathizers of the opposing team trying to eavesdrop on the communication between, let's say, different groups of coaches or groups of coaches and players and things like that. There's actually a tremendous amount of communication that happens between coaches and players radio-wise nowadays in sports. So when Motorola was going to come out with a sport radio, they had this idea of incorporating a scrambler into a series of sport radios. and that was the Motorola T6200 series, which were much more expensive than comparable, let's say, AudioVox radios, but engineered to meet all of the requirements for FRS radio service. For example, they couldn't legally make them with a removable or detachable antenna because that would allow for boosters and additional stuff to go in there which would transmit above the legal power limits. They do have transmit power limitations, which is actually just fine for short-range communication. We're not trying to talk across the country with these things. You're just trying to talk around the block, and they're going to work just fine for that. The other thing Motorola engineered into their radios, because they engineered this as a sport radio, is they made it very rugged. A lot of rubber stuff, a lot of shielding, a lot of composite housing type stuff. Although never considered to be submersible, they were shielded. The other thing they recognized was in standardizing the channels and the lockout codes with other brands, they made it where it's possible that the owners of these radios would be able to communicate with the owners of other brands of radios. They also included a scanning feature on these, but not as well as the Garmin radios. Short interruption. We'll talk a little bit more about these radios. You're going to find these at flea markets, used thrift stores sometimes. eBay, very good source for these. Occasionally some retailer that's going out of business where these are maybe open to merchandise in the back room. Looking at this one in particular, we can see that it had a manufacture date, when this goes into focus, of October 2001. As far as I know, FCC and or Department of Homeland Security had discreetly asked Motorola to remove these from the market at some point in early 2002. At that point, I was working in a retail business where we were getting these on a steep discount, and there was a rumor that they were about to be discontinued, and they were being sold at a steep discount where previously they had been introduced at close to $300 each. They were being sold as low as $60 or $70 each for this advanced model, which came with some added features such as a barometer or maybe even a compass or something like that. And then there was the plain 6200 model, which sold as low as about $35 each. And when you see these at flea markets, yard sales, and garage sales, a lot of times they'll just be, $3 to $5 or $10 each. For example, like these audio boxes that don't have those features. And you can get more tactical looking, better looking, brand new radios, let's say at Walmart, okay, with a neat camouflage finish for less money, which look like they have more features, but you need to understand that the scramble feature had been eliminated from the newer models. When GMRS came online as a publicly accessible radio, there's still a requirement for a license for GMRS, but nobody ever really goes and gets that. But it's a $10 license. They did have a GMRS version of these, which would transmit at higher power, which was not very popular because it was more expensive and was pulled off the market shortly after it was introduced onto the market. It also physically looked different from these, and Motorola did not totally scrap that more advanced model called the T6200, in that it was re-released without the scramble feature and without a few other features that were in the T7200. For example, the T7200 was capable of transmitting and receiving with a channel offset so that it could work with a repeater, but it had to be a GMRS enabled repeater. These will not work with that sort of a system. They will not work on a GMRS repeater. They will not do duplex transmit and receive. It's single channel. The advantage of using these radios like this is that A, you can greatly interfere with eavesdroppers by enabling the scramble code. What will happen is, even if they have listening equipment which is capable of differentiating which tone squelch you're using, and usually they don't, then what's going to happen is, even if they're eavesdropping on other users who are using a tone squelch, your transmissions in a scrambled are going to be unintelligible, and they will override what they're capable of listening to when other people are using the tone squelch, but without the scramble feature. So for example, if you had a group of people, you're using the scramble feature while other groups within that are on the same channel, but maybe not using the same lockout code or possibly using the same code. Some transmissions will be intelligible, others not intelligible. Now what happens, because the scrambling on this is more digital than the old school styles, is that that person can pick up parts of the conversation. They just can't pick up the whole thing. And they can hear that you're talking. They may be able to recognize that, let's say, a male from a female voice or something like that. Being able to specifically identify a person's voice while it's scrambled, extremely difficult, and if it were ever to go to court or something like that, probably impossible to prove. So you've got a level of plausible deniability when you use the scramble. Also realize that the scramble is not mandatory to use. Now, what condition you're going to find these radios in is going to vary tremendously. The other thing that's going to vary a lot is what accessories you're capable of getting with them. Fortunately, they were engineered to take AA batteries, and they were engineered to take rechargeable batteries. But remember, the technology of the late 90s, early 2000s was NiCad technology. So it's not clear, and it's quite probable that if you were to try and use lithium-ion batteries with the charging system here, you might have a little problem with the lithium-ion batteries, but we don't know for sure. The other cool thing is, of course, any accessories you can obtain is a good thing. So in this instance, a friend of mine was able to buy a batch off eBay, get car chargers, some rechargeable batteries along with the base station chargers, which are nice to have. You may also get belt clips, which are best just thrown away. The belt clips are fragile, you shouldn't use them. You should carry these radios in pouches. There's also different colors, obviously. There was a dark green that was sold at a hunter market. There was a lime green that was sold to the skier and snowboarder market. There was also radios in blue, white, and kind of a purple color. And what that did was that denoted some of the features on the radios, except that everything in the 6200 series had a scramble, which was not considered to be one of the primary selling features. Some of the other stuff was the altimeter and barometer and things like that. The accuracy of the altimeter and barometer was questionable, and what really took over the market as far as having any navigation aids in the radio was Garmin with the GPS that was built into the Rhino series. There was also something of a compass built into these, not particularly reliable. One of the reasons they didn't always have the best reviews. But as far as Motorola being in the handheld transmitter business, they're among the best. So look on eBay, look in Craigslist and things like that. If you ever happen to see these things, go ahead and contact me through the channel too. If you ever have any that you've encountered that you might have for sale, you may post that you have something for sale here, or that you're looking to purchase some in the comments section of this video. You have my permission to post these for sale, or that you're trying to find them in the comments section of this video. You may not post for sale radios which do not have a scramble feature, or which are very different from these, as a so-called recommendation. So I'm not going to accept any comments with links to third-party sellers that happen to have radios but they don't have a scramble feature, or they don't have the very specific tactical features these have. The other thing we might want to look into is accessories. These use the single pin Motorola accessory attachment as far as speaker mics or anything like that's concerned. It had actually, there's a blank spot in here. It appears that maybe they were going to go with a proprietary 2-pin model. Those two spots are too close to each other to use the original regular Motorola 2-pin type attachment. As far as I can tell, I think those are too close together. The single pin attachment, though, there was a number of relatively industry standard speaker mics that are available for these. As far as battery chargers go, these, because of this rather complex attachment point, they're proprietary to this series of radios. So you would need to find an original. And again, I think you're going to run into a compatibility problem with lithium-ion batteries. This was made to work with NiCad batteries, but because it has a battery compartment that's compatible with AA's, you could of course use removable lithium-ion batteries with a battery charger that's engineered to work that way. And you know, the radios are pretty durable. If somebody really needs help programming them, you can post in the comment section a request. If I get enough requests for a how-to video on programming and operating these, I'll do some additional video on these, but it's a little bit of a long drawn-out process to do that additional video, and I want to see if there's any interest out there before I go through the trouble of making the how-to videos on programming these.